Dave Garner. Who else? What about, anybody know Jerry Clower? Anybody think he's a pretty good storyteller? I don't know how many of his stories are true, but he tells them like they are, right? What about Andy Griffith? We think about the show, but if you listen to his comedy, it's just him telling stories. Those are two of my favorite storytellers. Well, what is it that makes a storyteller a good storyteller? Okay, there's some sort of entertainment value in it. Okay? And and different people find different things entertaining, right? And so who you might find to be a good storyteller because they entertain you may not entertain somebody else. But there is a sense of entertainment or enjoyment you get out of the story, and so that makes them a good storyteller. What else?
Usually the funniest things are real life. I mean, things that actually can happen because you identify with it.
Okay, so Nathan said a key word, you identify with it. Michael said has to be relatable, and I think those are key words. I don't know who said this. I saw this. It said, a good storyteller will bridge the gap between you and me and make the audience feel one with them. And I think that's what we see. When somebody we think is a good storyteller, what they've done is they've brought us into that story. And it helps us to go along with them and helps us to really be engaged in what they're telling. And those are effective ways that people, or that's ways that storytellers are effective. Jesus, was he a storyteller? He was a truth teller, certainly. But he also did much of his teaching through the telling of stories, the stories that we call parables. Jesus, his teachings, his recorded teachings, at least 1/3, it's parables. What is a parable? There's the Bible class definition, right? An earthly story with a heavenly meaning. What does that mean? Let me tell you what Aristotle said a parable is, and see if it clears it up. He said it implies an intuitive perception of a similarity in dissimilars. Does that help you? It didn't help me. So I think that's why we settle in on that earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's something that's told that is relatable to us, and it's true in its simplest form.
I was prepping for my class tomorrow on the subject of type of marketing.
Hang on.
I was prepping for my class tomorrow, and this is reminding me of the topic of a marketing thing where it's really all about the value to the audience, and I think that's a part of that definition that can be added that we can understand is that's what the parable was doing, was having value in a way that the audience would understand.
That's right. You could hear the story and think, okay, that's an interesting story. But there's more value to it than just that earthly story. There is a deeper meaning. There's a spiritual meaning. There's some other way that it can be applied. I think a literal definition of parable is to cast alongside. And so you think about a bowling alley. And you're not supposed to do this, I think. I think if somebody's in the lane next to you, you're not supposed to bowl at the same time as them. But sometimes that happens. But that's the idea. You've got these two things going right alongside each other, running parallel, and one is that earthly, and one is the spiritual. How did Jesus use parables? And it's a third of his teaching.
I mean, in Matthew 13, just the topics of all the parable were ranging from manual labor of the poor to things like the pearl, which would be something more able to connect with the wealthy, right? So there's a variety here, you know, the male, the female, the farmer, whatever. So he knew the audience in the way he captured that.
I also appreciate when he tells these stories, though, in his infinite wisdom, they were so structured around that time period, but we still can relate to them today with the knowledge that we have about the earth and farmers and plants and soil and people. None of that's changed. So the more you read it, the more we can get out of it today as we read them over and over again. You get something new out of those parables every time you read them,
That's
a deeper
right.
meaning.
That's right. Every time, it seems, or we notice as we read through the parables, oftentimes, David Jerry's got his hand up over here. They can't hear you online. That's.
Did he not, when he's telling these parables, I need to be careful because in my profession, I always use the word comparable. So we've got to be careful, Jerry. Parables, he usually took things that were common to the people to follow up with what John was saying. He would use these common things that everyone had at least a working knowledge of what was going on, and then he would apply it to the spiritual things. Does that make sense?
That's right.
Okay.
And that was his way to engage those who were hearing it. It's not the only way that he taught, but it seems to be a very effective way that he taught, a very common way that he taught. And so before we get into Matthew chapter 13, I'll just ask, I'll open it up. What is your favorite parable? And you can just call these out. We don't have to. Do you have a favorite parable? The prodigal son. The lost sheep. The lost coin is right there too, right there in Luke chapter 15. God's lost and found, sometimes it's called. Jason, it seems like Jason wants to say more. And if you want to say why, that's great too.
I think it's just because at one time or another we all find ourselves opening our eyes and realizing, how did I even get here? And the thought of, can I even return? You know, how can I come back from this? You know, in the past, I've dealt with a lot of people who have made a lot of really bad mistakes, and they've had horrible consequences. And sometimes it's torn families apart. You know, they've lost not only their family, but sometimes they've lost their job and they've lost everything they had. And physically, it looks like, material-wise, there's no recovering from it. But the good part is, Christ is trying to say, no matter where you find yourself, if you will just turn around and come back, not only will I let you come back, I'll run to you. I'll be excited to see you, and I don't care where you are. I don't care what you've done. If you come back and say you're sorry and say, I'm going to try to do better, then we're going to have a feast. We're going to have a party, and I'm not going to, rail against you. I'm not going to lecture you. You know that you've made a mistake. You know that you've done the wrong thing. That is so reassuring to me, because I find myself on a regular basis realizing, I'm off track again. How did I do this? And the fact that Christ is saying, don't worry about it. Come back to me. That's very comforting to me.
Do you think, Nathan, the lost sheep?
Well, I like that one in the lost coin, because every single person who's ever lived has lost things and can identify with that. And plus the fact that the guy in the story left all these other sheep, just left them just to go hunt up the one. And then he relates that to how God feels about us. I think it does a really good job of telling us how important we are to God, which is easy for me to forget.
Good point. Do you think one of the appeals of the parables of Jesus are the surprise endings? It's no surprise that a sheep would wander off from the flock. But it would be surprising, not very common, for the shepherd to leave all the rest of the sheep to go searching for that one. And so that surprise impacts us, and then when we get that spiritual meaning, and it shows the value that we have in the eyes of God, then it's a beautiful story that we can relate to and that we truly appreciate. Anybody else have a favorite?
I do appreciate how the parable of the sower emphasizes our role is different at different points. When I think about the parable of the sower, different types of soil, I think when I hear the Great Commission, it's easy to think we have to see everyone's journey to their very end, right? But I don't think God works that way. God puts us in particular spots to do particular things at particular times. And something about the parable of the sower always puts my mind in that direction.
And when you relate the parable of the sower to what Paul would later say about how he planted, Apollos watered, and who gave the increase? God gave the increase. So it's not up to us to carry it through all the way to the end, because we can't. And we never know what seed we might plant today may not take hold and spring up for another decade or more. So we do what we're supposed to do, and then we depend on God. And another appeal, because you put us in the place of the sower. Another appeal to me of the parables is you can relate to every character in the parables. Maybe we are sometimes that wayside soil, or that stony ground, or that thorny ground, or that good soil. And so we can relate, and we can see how we can plug in to this story, and it impacts us. Anybody else? Okay, another question then. Why did Jesus teach using parables?
Why do we correct our children with examples that have nothing to do with the situation they're currently in?
Why do we answer questions with a question? You want to do this? Right. Michael said, why do we correct our children with examples that aren't what they did, but are parallel?
I think sometimes, like with the Jews, I think they were so bound and so particular with the laws they were trying to follow that they forgot the point. And a lot of the parables, in my mind, are Jesus trying to show them the logic of the point. Not necessarily the letter of the law as far as what they were attempting to follow incorrectly, but you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Now, here's another question, Michael. You can keep the mic, because I'll just ask you.
And I'll ask you another one.
And the rest of you can answer too if you want to. But did those people, did the Pharisees, did the religious leaders understand the parables?
No, they doubled down.
That's right. And I think Jerry whispered under his breath that Jesus taught in parables to make it easy to understand. But is that the case? Let's read Matthew 13, 10 through 17.
Not asking him to explain.
They did. They did. Most of the time, he would explain. Because I think, you know, if we were just to hear these parables told, I don't know that we would pick up on the spiritual meaning. But it's easy for us to read the first 9 verses of Matthew chapter 13. That's the parable of the sower. And then jump down to verse 18, and Jesus explains it, and so now we get it. Right? But before that explanation, it maybe wasn't that easy to get. Starting in verse 10, then the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? And so these are the apostles. These are the ones that he chose to follow him, and they're wondering, why are you teaching this way? So they had heard him teach other ways, but they'd heard him teach a lot of parables, and after he tells this one, they wonder why. And so you get the impression, at least, that they didn't quite understand this parable, this story. And so, Jesus, this is maybe not the most effective way to teach, so why do you teach this way? And he answered them, to you it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand. You will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear. And their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. So did Jesus teach in parables so it would be easy to understand? Doesn't look like it. Now what's this quotation from Isaiah? It's Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. You remember that scene in Isaiah chapter 6? Isaiah's in the throne room. It's when he says, woe is me, I am undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King. And he's told to go and to preach to the people, and he has a question. He says, how long, Lord? And here's the answer. They'll hear but won't understand. They'll see but never perceive. Who is Jesus talking about when he says, when he's talking about them or they? To you it's been given, that's the apostles, to you it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. Who's that them? The ones that will not see. It's those who think they already have it all figured out. Maybe it's those religious elite of that day. So it's not easy to understand, but is it impossible to understand the parables? Even without explanation from Jesus, would it be possible to understand? This says we do. Of course, we do have some explanation. Some of the parables are explained by Jesus. Some of them are not.
I think that's part of the uniqueness of Jesus, the juxtaposition between he comes across very educated, very knowledgeable, but he does it in a manner that they understand. And so, whereas the religious elite of the day would get up basically and tell them, this is what you're supposed to do, similar in a way to, the early Catholic Church where, let me tell you what the Bible says, you're not smart enough to read it, to let me share this message with you in a manner that you understand, working on the farm, dealing with animals, you've lost something. And so, a message, a story, but with a deeper meaning, but in a manner that that he didn't lose their attention at the beginning.
Good point. Cliff.
To the ones that were listening that wanted the spiritual story, they heard it. These lesson here about the sower. Some of them, all they heard was a story about farming, as Nathan just said. Those that wanted to know about God heard the parallel story that was going alongside it that told about the kingdom. So, there's a difference there between those two.
Absolutely. And that's what I believe. Jesus taught in parables not to make it simple, but to make us put in some effort, to make us do some seeking to understand what the message really is. When Jesus speaks, we ought to listen. And when Jesus speaks, we ought to expect him to be sharing some spiritual truth. And so even if it's a story about a farmer, even if it's a story about a rich fool, even if it's a story about a grain of mustard seed, we ought to expect a spiritual meaning to come from the mouth of Jesus. And if we seek that truth, we'll find it. We'll be able to hear what Jesus was intending for us to hear, for the people of his day to hear. So what does it mean down in verses 16 and 17? He's talking to the apostles, but I think this can apply to us as well. Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. What did the prophets in the Old Testament, what were they longing to see? What were they longing to hear? What were the Pharisees in the first century, in Jesus' day? What were the Pharisees longing to hear and longing to see? The Messiah. And the prophets of old didn't. You think Isaiah wanted to see Jesus? Absolutely. You think Jeremiah wanted to see Jesus? Were Isaiah and Jeremiah very successful as prophets in their time? How many people did Jeremiah convince? None. How many people did Isaiah convince? None. And you know what? When he went into it, Isaiah knew nobody was going to listen. But he did it anyway. They wanted to see the Messiah. And here we are in Matthew chapter 13. Jesus tells the parable of the sower, and there are those people, those Pharisees, those chief priests, those who were the religious elite of the day. They were there. And Jesus said, they still don't see the Messiah. They still don't hear the Messiah. Well, they were there. They were in the crowd. They heard this story. They were watching Jesus present it. So what could it mean that they didn't see and didn't hear, even as they were right there in the crowd? Were they short like Zacchaeus? No trees around?
They were looking for the wrong thing.
Okay, Jason says they're looking for the wrong thing. What were they looking for?
They were looking for a return of the Israelite nation like it was under David. They were looking what it was like when they first came into the promised land where people ran from them. They were much as they were when they first, got a king. They wanted to be the rulers, and they wanted to be elevated. And so that's why they didn't see it. That's why they didn't understand it. They were looking for the wrong thing. And we often, I can speak for myself, I've often found myself in the same situation, that I've been doing the right things for the wrong reasons. And Christ was saying, here they are, and they know all the law. They do all these things. And like Nathan was saying, they're trying to say, let me explain this to you because you're not smart enough to understand it. They were elevating themselves above Christ. And so they're not going to look below themselves. They're trying to look, they're trying to look for something greater than them. And they had elevated themselves really to the point that there was nothing above them in their mind. And so, of course, they weren't going to look down to Christ. He was a troublemaker, and he was going to take away their power and their prestige.
That's right. And what's interesting, and this is kind of a tangent, what's interesting about that, if we disagree with somebody, we just avoid them. Or maybe we'll even say some bad things about them. But how many people have you actively engaged in trying to kill? Don't raise your hand. Because I don't think I want to know even if. But they weren't satisfied with just trying to keep him quiet. They wanted to kill him. Because in their mind, well, you think about Nathanael. Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And the implication is, in his mind, well, absolutely not. How much more? And he went on to become a follower, right? So how much more would these religious greats in their minds, how much more would they think nothing good can come out of Nazareth? There's no way that this man could be what we've been waiting for.
Besides his message was one that didn't make them as important as they wanted to be.
That's right. His message didn't make them as important as they wanted to be or as they thought they were. And so it's interesting to me that we get this explanation as to why Jesus taught in parables when he's going into this series of parables about the kingdom. And then we look at what the kingdom is compared to in these parables. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what's been sown in his heart. And so we see the kingdom being associated with that seed that's planted. There's a parable of the weeds in verses 24 through 30. And he says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. And then while he was sleeping, some men came in and sowed weeds. And what do we do about this? That's, I think, is Mark's favorite parable. He missed the what's your favorite parable question. And we'll get to it in a few weeks. And these are two that really jump out at me as something that would really upset those religious leaders who felt like they had it all figured out. They were waiting for this magnificent earthly king to come and to establish a powerful kingdom once again on this earth that would be a military force and a financial success. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid. Small things. And the value and the growth that can be experienced from even small things. And then the last one we'll look at in a few weeks, the parable of the fishing net. Who would compare the kingdom to a fishing net? Now, when you look at that parable, it makes perfect sense, especially as it's somewhat explained to us. So, Jesus taught in parables so people would seek to understand.
Well, and there was also emphasis, like, I don't think it's very intentional that, like, if you go down to verse 43 in that phrase, whoever has ears, let them hear. Because we see that phrase again in Revelation, and I think someplace else, I'd have to look it up, but that's too specific of a phrase to come at such strategic passages not to be significant.
He's doing some of the weeding out during his ministry. And he did it in a number of ways, and some of the ways he did it was through the parables. When people were like, he's telling these stories, and they're decent stories, but I mean, it's just stories about life. There's nothing funny about these stories. There's nothing that entertaining about these stories. It's just this guy went out and he spilled some seed on the side of the road, and then he planted some in a few places he had no business planting it in the first place, and then he planted it in good soil, and, well, what do you know? Good crop. But not a good crop in the other three places. I've had enough of these boring stories. And so the people who wanted to find the meaning stuck with him and got the meaning. Hebrews 11, verse 6. If any man comes to God, he must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And that verse, of course, is in a chapter that's all about faith. And so that faith motivates seeking. The apostles, we know that they believed Jesus was who he said he was, who he claimed to be. And so they were able, as he told them, to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. But those who didn't believe, they didn't get it. Next week is family night. Who's taking care of this family night? Is it Alan? Alan will be telling his life story to us. Maybe in a parable. In the form of a parable, Alan? He said, why not? So I hope that you'll be here for that. We won't be having a class in here next Wednesday night. Then we'll talk about the sower, and we'll talk about the weeds. We're going to combine the mustard seed and the leaven. We're going to combine the treasure that's hidden in the field and the pearl of great price. And then we'll wrap up the last Wednesday night of the year talking about the parable of the net. Jesus' parables engage us as believers. His parables are memorable to us. There are probably every one of us in here could at least tell the story of half a dozen parables. Our kids in the youngest classes can tell the story of one parable that Jesus told in the Sermon on the Mount. They've been singing that all their life. And some of you, I guess, probably have been too. That's right. It's basically a metaphor. But it's a little bit different because it's an extended metaphor. It has characters. It has storyline. It has a point. And that's what Jesus forces us to do, to get to the point, to solve that conflict, to solve that issue. We're going to talk for a few minutes tonight in the devotional about the Good Samaritan. And at the end of that parable, Jesus asks that lawyer, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? That's a good question, right? Jesus answered a question with a story and then a question. Because it all began with, who is my neighbor? Jesus said, love your neighbor. And so it stands to reason. I want to know who my neighbor is. And they were surprised by that story. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your attention tonight, Mr. Jerry.
How many parables were there? I've read different, around 36 is what I come up with. Is that right or am I wrong?
That's as good a guess as I can make. I don't know. I didn't count them. But he said he didn't count them either. That's homework. How about that? You got 2 weeks to count all the parables. We'll compare answers when we come back in 2 weeks.